The guard's final words hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus suddenly realized that he was no longer in control of this conversation. The tourists around them had formed a rough circle, and every face was turned toward the guard with an attention and respect that Marcus had spent the entire morning trying and failing to command. "This rifle," the guard continued, his voice still quiet but carrying absolute authority, "represents every British soldier who has ever carried a weapon in defense of others. This uniform connects me to the guards who stood at Waterloo, who held the line at Rorke's Drift, who walked into the machine guns at the Somme singing, 'It's a long way to Tipperary.'" Marcus tried desperately to think of a comeback, some way to regain his footing in this conversation that had spiraled completely beyond his control, but every word that came to mind seemed petty and small in the face of what he was hearing. "When I stand here, I'm not just representing myself," the guard said, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "I represent every guardsman who never came home. Every Welsh guard who died at Tumbledown Mountain in the Falklands. Every Coldstream guard who was killed at Dunkirk while covering the evacuation. Every Grenadier guard who was cut down at Normandy so that Europe could be free." The guard paused, and in that silence, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Around them, the tourists stood transfixed, many with tears in their eyes as they began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. "You asked when Britain last won a war on its own," the guard continued. "The Falklands, 1982. 8,000 miles from home, outnumbered, fighting in conditions that would make your Texas summers feel like air conditioning. We took back those islands because they were British soil, and British people lived there. No American soldiers, no NATO support, just British forces doing what we've always done, standing up for what's right, regardless of the odds." Marcus's face had gone pale. The confident businessman who had arrived at Windsor Castle that morning was nowhere to be seen, replaced by someone who was beginning to realize just how far out of his depth he had wandered. "But you're also wrong about something else," the guard said, and now there was almost a gentle tone in his voice as if he were educating a confused child. "You said nobody cares about British traditions anymore. That our special relationship with America is just Britain doing what America tells it to do." The guard gestured subtly toward the crowd around them, toward the tourists who had been filming and photographing, but were now simply listening with rapt attention. "These people came from all over the world to stand where we're standing now. Not because they were forced to, not because someone told them to, but because they wanted to connect with something larger than themselves. They come here because they understand what you don't," the guard continued, "that some things are worth preserving not because they're useful in a practical sense, but because they remind us of who we are and what we stand for. This uniform, this ceremony, this tradition, it's not about the past, it's about carrying the best of the past forward into the future." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The guard's quiet confidence had completely dismantled every argument he had made, every insult he had thrown, every assumption he had voiced. He felt like a man who had brought a knife to a gunfight, only to discover that his opponent had been carrying nuclear weapons the entire time. "The special relationship between Britain and America," the guard concluded, "isn't about one country following the other. It's about two nations that understand that freedom isn't free, that democracy requires constant vigilance, and that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right even when it's hard, even when it's costly, even when people like you question whether it's worth it." The guard's eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "Your grandfather at Normandy understood that. He and my great-grandfather probably shared a cup of tea on some French beach. Two soldiers from different countries but fighting for the same cause. They didn't argue about who was more important or who deserved more credit. They just did their job." Marcus stood in stunned silence, his carefully constructed arguments reduced to rubble by a few minutes of quiet, measured response from someone he had dismissed as irrelevant. Around them, the tourists began to applaud, softly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. But the guard simply returned to his original position, eyes forward, rifle at his side, as still and silent as he had been when Marcus first approached him. The difference was that now everyone understood the weight of that silence, the depth of dedication it represented, and the centuries of honor and sacrifice that stood behind it. Marcus Thompson from Texas had come to Windsor Castle looking for a photo opportunity and some easy laughs at the expense of British tradition. Instead, he had received an education in humility, respect, and the true meaning of service that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As he walked away from the castle that afternoon, his camera hanging unused around his neck, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had just encountered something far greater than himself, and that perhaps, for the first time in his adult life, he had been found wanting when measured against a standard that really mattered. The transformation was so gradual that most of the crowd missed it entirely, but those paying close attention saw the guard's posture shift almost imperceptibly, not breaking his military bearing, but somehow becoming more present, more focused, as if he were emerging from a state of meditation into one of complete awareness. Marcus, drunk on his own rhetoric and convinced of his superiority, noticed nothing. "You know what the real tragedy is?" Marcus continued, his voice now carrying across the entire courtyard. "It's that you actually believe in all this pomp and ceremony. You've been brainwashed into thinking that standing around in a costume somehow makes you important, but the rest of the world sees you for what you really are. Living museum pieces, relics of an empire that collapsed decades ago." He gestured broadly at the castle walls around them. "All of this, the castles, the crowns, the ceremony, it's just window dressing to hide the fact that Britain doesn't matter anymore. You're like actors in a play that nobody wants to watch, going through the motions because you don't know how to do anything else." The guard's eyes remained fixed on Marcus, but something fundamental had changed in their depths. Where before there had been professional detachment, now there was something that looked almost like pity, not for himself or his country, but for Marcus, for someone so blinded by his own prejudices that he couldn't see the depth of his own ignorance. "I'll bet you don't even understand what real sacrifice looks like," Marcus pressed on, his voice growing more venomous with each word. "American soldiers die for freedom, for democracy, for ideals that actually matter. But what do British soldiers die for? Tradition, ceremony? A queen who probably doesn't even know your name?" He laughed harshly. "At least our soldiers die for something real." That was the moment. That single sentence was the key that unlocked something that had been building throughout the entire confrontation. The guard's lips parted, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried with such clarity and authority that every person in the courtyard heard every word. "Sir," the guard said, his accent crisp and unmistakably British, each syllable pronounced with the precision of someone who had spent years learning to project his voice across parade grounds. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Welsh Guards. I was at Helmand Province when we lost Jenkins, Davies, and Thomas to an IED on a Tuesday morning that started just like this one." Marcus's mouth fell open in shock. After nearly an hour of trying to provoke a response, the sudden sound of the guard's voice hit him like a physical blow. But the guard was just getting started. Jenkins was 19. He joined up because his father served in the Falklands, and his grandfather at Normandy. Yes, the same Normandy where your grandfather served, and where British forces landed alongside Americans on gold and sword beaches, while you lot took Omaha and Utah. The guard's voice remained steady, controlled, but each word was delivered with surgical precision. Davies was 22. He had a daughter he'd never seen because we deployed before she was born. Thomas was 26, married his childhood sweetheart the week before we shipped out. The guard paused, letting the weight of these details settle over the crowd. They died fighting the same Taliban that American soldiers were fighting, alongside American soldiers, as part of the same mission to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Marcus tried to interrupt, to regain control of the narrative, but found that words had deserted him entirely. The guard's quiet authority had completely transformed the dynamic of the confrontation, turning Marcus from prosecutor to defendant in the space of a few sentences. "After Afghanistan, I did a tour in Iraq," the guard continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space. "Before that, our regiment served in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Sierra Leone, and the Gulf. My father served in the Falklands, my grandfather in Korea and Malaysia, my great-grandfather at Monte Cassino in Normandy." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Marcus found himself taking another step backward, though he couldn't quite explain why. There was something in the guard's voice that spoke of depths he had never imagined, of experiences that made his own complaints about slow service and long queues seem pathetically trivial. "But you're right about one thing, sir," the guard said, and for a moment Marcus felt a flicker of vindication. "This uniform is ceremonial. These duties are largely symbolic." Marcus began to smile, thinking he had been proven right after all, but the guard wasn't finished. "The difference is we know exactly what symbols mean." The moment stretched on, pregnant with possibility. as Marcus and the guard maintained their locked gaze. The crowd had grown completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple tourist's rude behavior. Even the castle's ravens seemed to have stopped their cawing, as if nature itself was paying attention to what was about to unfold. Marcus, desperate to break the uncomfortable silence and reassert his dominance, decided to escalate even further. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice wavering slightly despite his attempts to sound confident. "You British think you're still relevant because of what happened 100 years ago. But the world has moved on. Nobody cares about your royal family, your traditions, or your little toy soldiers anymore." He gestured dismissively at the guard's immaculate uniform. "Afghanistan proved it, didn't it? 20 years of fighting, and what did Britain accomplish? Nothing that America couldn't have done better and faster on our own. Your special forces, your intelligence services, your military might, all second-rate compared to what we bring to the table." The guard's expression never changed, but something deeper seemed to be stirring behind those steady eyes. It was as if Marcus's words were awakening something that had been dormant, something that went far beyond one soldier's personal pride or professional discipline. The very air around them seemed to be charged with an energy that made the fine hairs on the back of nearby tourists' necks stand on end. "Face it," Marcus continued, emboldened by what he mistook for continued passivity. "Britain is a has-been nation trading on past glories. Your military couldn't fight its way out of a wet paper bag without American support. Even in World War II, you were losing until we showed up to save the day, and now you're just our lapdog, following us around and hoping some of our success rubs off on you." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. Even tourists who had no particular love for Britain found themselves disturbed by the viciousness of Marcus's attack. An elderly American veteran, recognizable by his VFW cap, shook his head in disgust and began to walk away, muttering something about, "That's not what we fought for." But Marcus was just getting started. "And don't even get me started on your so-called special relationship with America," he sneered. "That's just diplomatic language for Britain does what America tells it to do. You're not our partner. You're our puppet. We pull the strings, and you dance." The guard's breathing remained controlled, but there was something almost supernatural about his stillness now. He had become less like a human being and more like a conduit for something much larger than himself. The centuries of British military history seemed to be flowing through him, from the archers at Agincourt to the fighters of the Battle of Britain, from the thin red line at Balaclava to the commandos at D-Day. "Your whole country lives in the past because you have no future," Marcus declared, his voice rising to carry across the entire courtyard. "You're a tiny island nation with delusions of grandeur, playing at being important while the real powers of the world, America, China, Russia, decide how the world actually works." Several tourists had begun to film the confrontation now, sensing that they were witnessing something that would soon be shared across social media platforms around the world. Marcus, noticing the cameras, seemed to gain even more confidence, as if he were performing for a global audience. "I bet you don't even know your own military history," he taunted, stepping closer again. "Probably just memorized a few dates for the tourists. Tell me, when did Britain last win a war on its own? When did your military last accomplish something that actually mattered without American help?" He paused dramatically. "That's what I thought." Silence, because there is no answer. But Marcus had made a critical error in his assumptions. He had mistaken the guard's disciplined silence for ignorance, his professional stillness for weakness, his respectful duty for inability to defend himself or his nation. What Marcus couldn't see, what his arrogance prevented him from understanding, was that he was not facing just one young soldier in a ceremonial uniform. He was facing the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of military tradition. The ghost of every British soldier who had ever stood guard, fought, bled, and died for something greater than himself. The guard's lips, which had remained sealed throughout the entire ordeal, began to move almost imperceptibly, not yet speaking but preparing to speak. Those closest to him could sense the change, the subtle shift from passive endurance to active engagement. Something was coming, and Marcus, in his blind arrogance, had no idea what storm he was about to face. Marcus had worked himself into a frenzy of self-righteousness, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls as he continued his tirade. "You want to know what real military service looks like?" he demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at the motionless guard. My grandfather stormed the beaches of Normandy. He didn't stand around in a fancy hat playing dress-up for tourists. He fought actual Nazis with actual bullets. The irony of his words was lost on Marcus, but not on the growing crowd. Several visitors had begun to look distinctly uncomfortable with his behavior, and some were already starting to drift away, not wanting to be associated with the ugly scene that was unfolding. But Marcus was beyond caring about public opinion now. He had found his target, and he was determined to get a reaction. "I bet you've never even been in a real fight," Marcus continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Probably went straight from school into this costume party. No real combat experience, no deployment overseas, just marching around castle grounds pretending to be important." He leaned closer, his face now just inches from the guard's profile. "Am I right? Come on, just nod if I'm right." The guard remained statue still, but the tension in the air was becoming almost palpable. Other tourists were beginning to sense that something significant was building, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. The very atmosphere around Windsor Castle seemed to be holding its breath, as if the stones themselves were preparing for something momentous. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small American flag pin that he wore on his lapel during business trips. "See this?" he said, holding it up in front of the guard's face. "This represents a country that actually matters in the world. A country that doesn't need to rely on pageantry and tradition to feel important. When America speaks, the world listens. When Britain speaks," he paused dramatically, "well, nobody really cares anymore, do they?" A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Even those tourists who weren't British seemed to understand that Marcus had crossed a line from ignorant commentary into outright insult. The elderly British couple from earlier had stopped their retreat and were now watching with expressions of barely contained outrage. "Your whole country is like a theme park now," Marcus pressed on, seemingly oblivious to the changing mood around him, living off the glory days that ended decades ago. "The sun has definitely set on the British Empire, hasn't it, soldier boy? Now you're just America's junior partner, standing around in your pretty uniforms while we do the real work of keeping the world safe." The guard's chest rose and fell with the same controlled rhythm it had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. But something almost electrical was building in the space between him and Marcus. The morning light seemed to catch the polished brass of his uniform differently, as if the metal itself was responding to some unseen energy. Marcus misread the continued silence as validation of his points. "That's what I thought," he said triumphantly. "Nothing to say because you know I'm right. Your whole military is just for show now. Ceremonial guards, ceremonial positions, ceremonial importance in a world that's moved on without you." He gestured broadly at the castle around them. "This whole place is just a museum to what Britain used to be." But then something happened that Marcus hadn't anticipated. The guard's eyes, which had been fixed on a distant point throughout the entire confrontation, slowly shifted. With the deliberate precision of a gun turret rotating to acquire a target, the guard's gaze moved until it locked directly onto Marcus's face. The movement was so subtle that some in the crowd missed it entirely, but those who caught it felt their breath catch in their throats. For the first time since his arrival at Windsor Castle, Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty. The guard's eyes weren't angry or hostile, but they held something far more unsettling. They held the weight of knowledge, of experience, of truths that Marcus in his ignorance couldn't even begin to comprehend. It was like staring into the depths of history itself, and for just a moment Marcus felt very small and very alone. But his ego quickly reasserted itself. "Oh, so now you're trying to intimidate me?" Marcus forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Giving me the stare-down treatment? That's the best you can do?" Yet even as he spoke, he found himself taking an unconscious step backward, though he tried to disguise the movement as a casual shift in position. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by Marcus's increasingly bold commentary. Tour groups that had been moving through other parts of the castle grounds found themselves gravitating toward the commotion, their guides looking increasingly nervous about the situation developing before them. Marcus, emboldened by his growing audience, decided to push his luck even further. "I mean seriously," he continued, circling around the guard like a predator stalking prey. "When was the last time Britain actually won a war without American help? World War II? We had to bail you out. Afghanistan? We led that operation. Even the Falklands was just a minor skirmish against a third world country. His voice dripped with condescension as he gestured dismissively at the historic castle walls surrounding them. The guard remained perfectly still, but something had changed in the atmosphere. Other guardsmen stationed at various points around the courtyard seemed to have developed an almost magnetic awareness of the situation. While they couldn't turn their heads or break their positions, their presence felt more intense, more focused. It was as if the very stones of Windsor Castle were beginning to bristle with centuries of accumulated pride and honor. Marcus pulled out a $20 bill from his wallet and waved it in front of the guard's face. "Tell you what, soldier boy, I'll give you $20 if you just say one word. Anything at all. Just prove to me that you're actually a real person under all that costume." The bill fluttered in the morning breeze, just inches from the guard's nose, but he might as well have been offering it to one of the castle's stone gargoyles. "Oh, I get it," Marcus said with a knowing grin. "You probably don't even speak English very well, do you? Maybe you're one of those foreign recruits they let into the British Army now. Can't blame you for not understanding what I'm saying." His assumptions were delivered with the casual racism of someone who had never been challenged about such comments in his own social circles. A middle-aged woman with a distinct Edinburgh accent finally spoke up from the crowd. "That's quite enough," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You're being disrespectful to a soldier who's serving his country." But Marcus was too intoxicated by his own performance to pay her any attention. "Lady, this isn't serving his country," Marcus shot back without even turning to look at her. "This is serving tourists. There's a difference. Real soldiers are out there fighting actual enemies, not standing around looking pretty for photo opportunities." He turned back to the guard with renewed vigor. "Isn't that right, pretty boy? When's the last time you saw any real action?" The guard's breathing remained controlled, but those with sharp eyes might have noticed the slight shift in his stance, the almost imperceptible adjustment of his grip on his rifle. His training had taught him to endure many things, but the systematic degradation of his service and his brothers in arms was testing even his legendary discipline. "You know what I think?" Marcus announced, now playing to his audience like a comedian working a crowd. "I think these guards are chosen specifically because they can't think for themselves. They're probably not allowed to think. Just stand there, look intimidating, and let the tourists take their pictures. No real training required." An American tourist in the crowd, clearly embarrassed by his countryman's behavior, tried to intervene. "Hey man, maybe you should just leave him alone. He's doing his job." But Marcus was beyond reason now, drunk on the attention and convinced of his own superiority. "His job?" Marcus laughed harshly. "His job is to be a living museum exhibit. These guys probably couldn't find their way out of a paper bag without written instructions." He stepped even closer to the guard, now close enough that his breath was probably visible on the polished buttons of the red tunic. The guard's eyes never wavered from their fixed point, but something deeper was stirring. This wasn't just about one ignorant tourist anymore. This was about everything the uniform represented, everything his brothers had died for, everything that Marcus in his arrogance couldn't begin to understand. The weight of history was gathering like storm clouds, and Marcus had no idea what he was about to unleash. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as tourists began their daily pilgrimage to witness one of Britain's most enduring traditions. Among them walked Marcus Thompson, a boisterous American businessman from Texas who had made his fortune in oil and wasn't shy about letting everyone know it. His expensive camera hung around his neck like a trophy, and his voice carried across the courtyard with the confidence of someone who believed money could buy him access to anything. Marcus had been complaining loudly since arriving at the castle gates. The queue was too long, the weather was too damp, and the tour guide spoke too quietly for his liking. But what bothered him most was the sight of the Queen's Guard standing at their posts, rifles at their sides, tall black bearskin hats casting shadows over their faces, maintaining their legendary silence and stillness. "I don't get it," Marcus announced to anyone within earshot, which was practically everyone in the vicinity. "What's the point of having guards who just stand there like statues? Back in America, our guards actually do something. They talk, they move, they interact with people. These guys are just for show, right?" The other tourists shifted uncomfortably, some glancing nervously at the nearest guardsman who stood just 20 feet away. The guard was young, perhaps in his early 20s, with the rigid posture that spoke of countless hours of training and discipline. His red tunic was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, and his white gloves gripped his rifle with practiced precision. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording, stepping closer to the guard. "Hey there, buddy," he called out cheerfully as if addressing a friend at a barbecue. "Smile for the camera. You're going to be famous back in Dallas." The guard remained motionless, staring straight ahead with eyes that seemed to look through Marcus rather than at him. "Come on, just a little wave," Marcus persisted, now standing directly in front of the guard. "I know you can hear me. Don't you guys ever get tired of this? Standing around all day pretending to be toy soldiers?" A few tourists began to murmur, some pulling out their own phones to record what they sensed might become an interesting confrontation. The guard's breathing remained steady and controlled, his face a mask of professional composure, but something almost imperceptible shifted in his stance, a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested he was very much aware of everything happening around him. Marcus, however, was too caught up in his own performance to notice these small signs. "I bet you don't even know how to use that rifle," Marcus continued, his voice growing louder and more challenging. "It's probably not even loaded, is it? Just a prop for the tourists to take pictures with." He gestured dramatically at the weapon, causing several nearby visitors to take involuntary steps backward. An elderly British couple exchanged worried glances, the woman tugging gently at her husband's sleeve as if to suggest they move to a different area. A group of Japanese tourists lowered their cameras, sensing that the jovial atmosphere of their sightseeing expedition was taking an uncomfortable turn. Marcus seemed oblivious to the growing tension. He had found his audience, and years of dominating business meetings had taught him how to command attention. "You know what I think?" he announced, now addressing the crowd as much as the guard. "I think this whole thing is outdated. Standing around in fancy costumes, pretending to protect a queen who probably doesn't even live here most of the time. It's all just theater for the tourists, isn't it?" The guard's eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond Marcus's shoulder, but those who looked closely might have noticed the slightest tightening of his jaw. His training had prepared him for many things, but dealing with disrespectful tourists required a special kind of patience that even the British Army's rigorous discipline couldn't always provide. "In America, we respect our military because they actually fight for our freedom," Marcus continued, warming to his theme. "But this is just playing dress-up for the history books. When's the last time one of you guys actually had to defend anything real?" His words carried across the courtyard, causing conversations to die away as more people turned to watch the unfolding scene.